When I woke up in the Universitätsklinik Carl Gustav Karras, with the pale November light slipping through the blinds, I knew two things. One was obvious: the body gives way without asking permission. The other hit like a draft of cold air. Once they think you're down, even your own might slip a hand into your pocket. It wasn't a dramatic thought. More like a diagnosis, a clinical recognition from someone watching a monitor trace its gentle peaks and valleys. Life. Opportunity. And the faint road signs of greed. My name is Derek Koch. 35. Digital forensic analyst. I work with traces, not certainties. The men who hire me usually look at me the way one stares at a lock they no longer remember how to open, half afraid, half proud of their own trap. On my desk there's always something of cold coffee, encrypted drives, and the lingering sense that no one is as innocent as they claim. Sometimes, not even me. I live in Dresden, a quiet district in Dresden where the facades seem to yawn in the morning. Trams pass with the rhythm of a heartbeat, and the trees shed their leaves as if shrugging off the weight of summer. My routine was simple: pedal down Schandauer Strasse, sometimes cross into the Grosser Garten to clear my head, and, if the weather allowed, stop to watch the Elbe from the Blaues Wunder Bridge, its strange, worn-out blue, as if it carried too many stories. My grandmother, Adelia, lives in Loschwitz, in a wooden house that creaks with dignity. It's where I learned to read, staring at the kitchen calendar she'd hang each year, every date written in a different hand, every month with its own scent: rye flour, apple, Marseille soap. My sister, Janelle, lives near the Altstadt, in an apartment bought just as the renovation fever swept through the center. My cousin Axel floated from job to job, always chasing easy shine, never detail. The emergency came at night, the way things arrive when they mean to split you in two. I don't need to go into detail. Pain hit on the wrong side, there were sirens, hands that cut away my clothes without asking. An elevator, a white ceiling, the smell of disinfectant, and that sound of rolling bed wheels like the murmur of an underground river. I remember the entrance through the glass doors of the ER, the fluorescent line guiding me like an arrow to a windowless room. My body shut down with an obedience that still embarrasses me. I was seized by the certainty that we control almost nothing. The rest came later. There are moments when what you've learned is useless, at least at first. I was sedated. Time blurred. German voices reached me, words my brain chewed like stale bread. When I finally began to follow a thread again, it was daytime, and through the window I could see the Frauenkirch Tower in the distance, a dome watching without moving. Old snow lingered on the curbs. From the 5th floor, the Elbe looked like a dull ribbon. The monitor traced an acceptable rhythm. And I, hovering between exhaustion and dry lucidity, began to take inventory. Bones, fine. Memory, decent. Phone, missing. Wallet, someone had kept it safe. I felt like an incomplete algorithm. And then I thought of Adelia. My grandmother has a gesture for when she refuses to cry. She grips her teacup as if it were a lifeline. On winter Sundays, the bells of the Kreuzkirche mark the hour and she lights a candle for those no longer here. For me, she lit two, just in case. Her money was always tidy. Not wealth, but solidity. Her trust fund, what was left of her father's business, existed so the grandchildren wouldn't fall too far when they stumbled. That's what she used to say, for when one of you trips and can't get back up. That's what the notary repeated, in his office near Neumarkt, surrounded by polished wood and glass meant to make you feel serious. I never needed to touch that money. Maybe I was lucky, maybe I'd been raised with hunger for other things. But knowing it existed taught me a quiet lesson: love can take the shape of structure. With the hospital's borrowed phone, I started doing the only thing I know when life turns gray: verify. I logged into my accounts through the hospital's ancient web browser, a dinosaur with ridiculous security measures, and saw a few unnervingly polite notifications, recent logins from places I didn't recognize, confirmation of transfers I hadn't approved. It took my brain a couple of heartbeats to grasp it: someone was moving money. A lot. The world might be turning slowly, but the numbers were running. Banks have a way of speaking that sounds like an instruction manual for furniture, never describing, only hinting. I read between the lines. I switched from that prehistoric browser to my own laptop, which a nurse brought over after catching the look on my face. Power on. Load. My fingers hesitated 2 seconds over the keyboard, then slipped into habit, VPN, encrypted disk, tokens. I arranged the screen like an operating table, accounts on the left, logs on the right, access reports above, notes below. I breathed, counted to 5, and entered the first bank. The numbers hit like falling bricks. From my checking account, for transfers had gone out in 48 hours. Rounded sums, the kind made by someone careful not to draw attention. Destination, a new account, in another bank, under a company name that smelled of improvisation. From my savings, 3 more withdrawals, no clear pattern. And then the one that stopped my breath for a second, the trust fund. My grandmother's fund. I was one of the beneficiaries, with limited viewing rights, and yet the movements there were still warm. When the body fails, everything else rushes to follow. The bank's internal protocol is simple if you know where to look. The access log spoke to me in the language I understand better than any of my native tongues: IPs, user agents, session fingerprints. There were logins from 2 home networks in Dresden and 1 cafe in the Außer Neustadt I recognized instantly by the timestamps. At those hours, that place stays open late, serving beer to students debating theories that won't pay their rent. One of those home networks snagged at me like a splinter. The name matched the router I'd set up for Janelle months before. Janelle 5G. I wrote it down in my notepad, without emotion, the way one collects serial numbers. The other was worse: Axel Home. Axel was never one for imagination. I paused. Looked out the hospital window at the dirty white sky. The winter light in Dresden at that hour has the texture of damp paper. I focused on my breathing. Noted the ache in my side. And I knew I couldn't reveal myself. So I did what I'd been trained to do since childhood: stay still on the outside, move the pieces within. I faked weakness. I faked more pain than I felt. I faked being slower. A nurse jotted something down. A doctor told me to rest. I nodded without making any promises. The messages began to arrive like bees, my sisters, with phrases that sounded measured but carried an edge, my cousins, clumsy as ever, asking about my recovery and adding 5 prayer hand emojis for good measure. I replied with monosyllables, with ellipses that left room. A thief needs silence from the other side to feel safe. I gave them that. At the same time, I started building walls. Activated additional logs, mirrored copies of emails, discrete alerts. Drew a map, locations, hours, devices. I wrote to my bank, citing a few sections of law and identifying myself as a verified client, to request the raw session logs. They don't hand those out to just anyone. They gave them to me, I suspect, because I was speaking their language and they knew that otherwise, I'd be speaking it to someone louder. Numbers, once aligned, tell stories that don't need shouting. The sequence unfolded: the night of my admission, a login from Janelle 5G. 30 minutes later, a new beneficiary created. A small test transfer. Wait. When nothing bounced back, the big ones were launched. At dawn, another session from Axel Home mirrored the operations into different accounts. In between, a check on my grandmother's fund. That access wasn't mine. I needed proof that it wasn't. And I had it. The user agent showed a cheap Android phone. I use iOS. Browser fingerprinting doesn't lie. I cross-referenced it with another session, Axel's email, the previous afternoon, from the same IP. I logged everything with timestamps down to the millisecond, because precision is the only courtesy I allow betrayal. I didn't want to call the police from the hospital. Too final an act. Not out of mercy, out of strategy. I wanted to hear something from their mouths that would save me the trouble later. Thieves always gift you one sentence too many. I asked a nurse to let my grandmother come up. She hesitated. Visits were limited. I explained briefly. She allowed it. Adelia arrived wrapped in a wool coat that smelled of her house and old wood. When she saw me, she pressed her lips together and took my hand. I, who never tremble, felt my blood drain to a part of the body that's useless for thinking. She said my name as if writing it on ice: Derek. I asked if she'd spoken to Janelle lately. Her gaze fell. She said yes. She came to help with the house, with my papers. Said you asked her to check a few things. That's when I knew the line between planning and vulgarity had already been crossed. I asked my grandmother for a short written authorization to review her accounts and devices in the interest of her protection. If you're going to step into a smoking kitchen, bring a glove. She signed it in her slanted handwriting, the tremor turning to lead in my notes. My first meeting with the suspects came 2 days later. They arrived together, standing at opposite ends of my bed as if I were a table. Janelle spoke more. Axel nodded alone. I told them I was in pain, that my vision was blurry, that everything was slower. Made a bad joke about hospital gelatin tasting like sad chemistry. They smiled mechanically. Brought flowers, though I've never understood their purpose in a place where plants don't survive 3 days. I asked them to bring my backpack from Adelia's house whenever they could. Axel agreed to everything. Janelle said of course in the same tone she uses to say I love you when she really means be careful. That night, with the hallway empty, I checked the security cameras in my apartment, more out of habit than paranoia, and saw Axel enter using his emergency key. At another time, it might have angered me. That night, I stayed perfectly still, counted to 10, and kept working. The NAS log showed navigation attempts through my accounting folders. Someone searched passwords, bank, docs. Someone found the decoy file I'd maintained for years, a document dated 4 years back, filled with fake passwords and clues leading to an empty drawer. They opened it. I saw how long they stayed inside. I smiled inwardly. The oldest trap in the world still works best on those who believe the world owes them shortcuts. I didn't stop. From an old family audit, I recovered a backup of my grandmother's phone. It wasn't current, but it gave me a map. With the written permission she'd left me, I requested from her carrier a list of calls and texts from that week, not the content, only the metadata. I graphed them. It looked like a resting heart with arrhythmia, countless calls between Janelle and Axel, intense, at precise intervals that lined up with the peaks of movement in the accounts. Meanwhile, from my grandmother's line, long calls to a notary I didn't know. I noted it all with the patience of someone writing down the ingredients of a recipe. Then I went back to my accounts. Cross-referenced the hours. A dance. Not elegant, but persistent. Someone had thought I'd never look again. I won't dwell on the medical part. There were tests, exams, a minor surgery, rest. The hospital, with its scent of plastic and metal, served as my mask. I was the obedient patient, quiet, nodding. No one bothers the obedient. Between one dawn and the next, I arranged everything, screenshots, logs, signed requests. I built a file with color tabs, each hue marking a type of evidence, blue for bank movements, gray for access logs and sessions, green for communications, red for actions involving my grandmother's fund. I wanted that, when the time came to put it before their eyes, there'd be no noise. I wanted silence to do the heavy work. I left the hospital on a cloudy afternoon. The air in Dresden sometimes has the texture of ground glass. I walked slowly along the sidewalk toward the tram stop. No one congratulates you for walking out of a place where you arrived in a bed, but they should. The city received me with its near-sat order, bicycles parked with discipline, shop windows lit in white, faces that don't meet your eyes for more than 2 seconds. I crossed Pragerstrasse like a ghost with cold bones. Stopped to look at a storefront where the dome of the Frauenkirche reflected against a tired sky. Life, I thought, sometimes sounds like that reflection, a new building made of old stones, and everyone convinced it's the same. That night I went to Adelia's house. The heat was high, the hallway smelled of wax. I sat in her kitchen and told her, like describing an experiment, what I had found. She gripped her teacup. Didn't cry. Told me, in a low voice, that she'd trusted Janelle to sort some accounts while I was away, that she'd signed papers without her glasses because the light hurt her eyes, that Axel had driven her there and back. I took her hand. Told her not to blame herself. Blaming the victim is the coward's shortcut. I asked her not to make any move until I said so. Asked her that if Janelle called, she'd act normal. Mothers and grandmothers always want to fix things with words, but you can't repair what was broken with gestures by talking it over. The plan for the confrontation was never epic. It was arithmetic. I sent a message to the family group, the only useful thing that chat full of birthday photos and recipes had ever done, and asked that we meet the following Saturday at noon, at Adelia's house. I chose that hour for one simple reason: the light hits the dining room window at an angle that makes dust particles visible. I wanted to see the dust in the air while we talked. I wanted time to be visible. Saturday, Dresden woke under a low mist that clung to the bones. I walked through Loschwitz as if the street belonged to me. The old houses seemed to hold their breath. In the garden, the snow was that kind of white frost that doesn't sing. Adelia made soup, not because we'd eat, but because that's how she gives warmth to pain. Janelle arrived in a coat too big for her and a smile she'd borrowed from magazines. Axel came with a heavy cologne trying to mask his hurry. We sat. I thanked them for coming. Janelle asked about my health in a voice that barely hid her wish to leave early. Axel checked his phone. Adelia placed bread on the table, as if bread could offer us a better idea of who we were. I won't dramatize what I said. There's no power in theatrics, power lives in tone. I pulled out a folder. Opened it. Laid the pages before them. Started with the obvious, statements from my accounts. Movements, dates, amounts. A stream of money with the same pulse my monitors hadn't dared to hold. For every sheet, a corresponding IP. For every IP, a name. I matched hours to calls. Showed screenshots of the newly created beneficiaries, with their idiotic aliases. Janelle spoke first. Said she didn't understand. Said it was a misunderstanding. Said the pain must be confusing me. Then fell silent. Axel said he didn't know what any of this was about, that someone must have used his Wi-Fi, you know how it goes. I told him yes, I know people think Wi-Fi is a black hole. Pointed a finger at a line: you logged into my bank at 3:14. At 3:22 you messaged Janelle, done. At 3:29 you logged out. At the same time, from her house, someone accessed Grandma's fund. At that hour, Axel, your phone checked your email and downloaded an attachment with the notary's instructions. I have the log. We didn't shout. That was the day's victory. Janelle leaned back in her chair and said it scared her that I was watching her. I told her I wasn't watching, I was reconstructing what others had moved. Not the same thing. Axel waved a hand, brushing away invisible flies. Adelia, with a stillness from another century, said, Ja. When a German grandmother says Ja in that tone, it means, don't lie to me again. Janelle turned her eyes toward the window. Outside, the sunlight had the color of a clean knife. Axel sighed. I thought he might apologize. He didn't. He said something worse: we thought you weren't coming back. He'd written it once, and now he said it. We thought you weren't coming back. There was no truth greater than that, no need for further investigation beyond that verb in past tense. They thought. They bet. When you gamble against someone's life, win or lose, you've already lost. I didn't tell them that. I took a breath. Explained, as you do with a client, the steps ahead, my formal complaint, the restitution I demand, the bank's process for reversing transactions as far as the time window allowed, and my report to the police. I told them I'd accompany our grandmother to the notary to amend whatever needed amending. They looked at me the way one looks at someone who wakes you in the middle of the night without apologizing. What I felt wasn't anger, it was a kind of hollow clarity. The following Monday, the city was colder. I crossed the Augustusbruck toward the Altstadt with the file in my backpack. The elbow was a gray serpent weaving through the ice with patience. People walked with their heads down, as if each had their own defendants to face. I went first to the bank. Presented what was necessary. The woman at the counter had that practiced neutrality that keeps her from being surprised by anything. I was grateful for it. She said they'd do what they could, that they'd freeze what could be frozen. I left copies. Then I went to the police. Filed the report with words that didn't tremble. I didn't do it for revenge. I did it because the story had to be complete. Without that part, everything before would have been only a private gesture, and private gestures had already brought us here. Formal investigation moves at another rhythm, slower, clumsier than that of an analyst working alone. Deadlines shift. The examiners want to see what you've already seen and tell you about it again. I gave them access to what they asked for. I didn't present myself as an expert, it wasn't the place. It was enough to turn my notes into a factual report, clean, with integrity hashes for every piece of evidence, no embellishments. Truth doesn't need italics. Meanwhile, I called the notary my grandmother had spoken with at Janelle's request. A polite man, precise. He confirmed, without breaking any rules, that Mrs. Adelia had signed documents to facilitate transfers. I explained that, with her consent, she wanted to review everything. We understood each other through a voice that sounded like a waxed wooden hallway. On Thursday, I took her to the notary she'd trusted all her life, 2 streets from Newmarket, where tourists usually stare into shop windows without buying anything. Adelia wore a dark coat and a scarf patterned with faded flowers. She walked upright, that kind of dignity that doesn't need justification. The notary greeted us with a good morning that already knew why we were there. We spoke softly. A new will was drafted. The trust adjusted. I don't need to say the figures here, they don't matter. What mattered was the gesture. Adelia, with her small handwriting, signed. For a moment she stared at the paper the way one looks at an old photograph. She didn't cry. Her eyes shimmered with the kind of water that never falls. Outside, the cold hit us like a simple truth. She took my arm. We crossed the square slowly. The Frauenkirche loomed, massive, implacable, its new stones pressed against the old. I thought about that seam. No building exists without being one memory welded to another. Janelle tried calling a few times that week. I didn't answer. She sent a long message accusing me of years of things that never happened. I didn't defend myself. There was no point. Axel stayed silent, the kind of silence some men make when they've lost. They didn't show up the next Sunday at Adelia's house. She made soup anyway. We ate in silence. There is no silence more honest than the one you choose. What followed were procedures, and nights sleeping with one eye open. The Staatsanwaltschaft Dresden moved with its discreet machinery. There were notifications. A precautionary hold on certain funds. Statements. I spoke little, just enough. You learn that talking too much is like leaving coins on an unwatched table. One afternoon the bank called to confirm a partial reversal of the transactions. Not everything, but enough to keep a roof over the house. Adelia said thank you with the restraint her generation saves for big words. I told her not to thank me, that what we were doing together is called protecting. In the days that followed, I realized my body was moving forward without consulting me. I walked along the Brolsch terrace as one sets an emotional table in order. I watched the river, saw a tourist boat glide by with a few brave souls on deck. My gaze stopped at the wall, at the human scars of the city. Every so often, a gull descended as if to point something out. The air carried the smell of coffee from the terraces and a faint drift of smoke from a sausage stand refusing to die in winter. In the distance, the dome of the Frauenkirche never tires of reminding you that anything can fall and be rebuilt without apology. I leaned on the railing. Knew I was less angry than sad. Sadness, in me, doesn't make noise. It dries my throat. Makes me more methodical. Janelle asked to see her. Adelia. On a Friday. Adelia called to tell me. I told her I wouldn't go. To ask no questions. To just listen. She obeyed, because she knows my obedience to her is of the same kind. I never learned what they said. I didn't ask. Some scenes are better kept on the blind side of the mirror. What I did know came after. Janelle texted me, "I'm sorry," a message so brief it angered me for its belated frugality. Then, "Do what you think is right." Then silence. Axel, on the other hand, wrote with the desperation of a man who sees the letterhead approaching and thinks he can scare it off with words, "We can fix this between us." I didn't answer. The between us had expired. Talking about family in this city is like talking about stones. They're solid until one of them shifts when you least expect it. I remember crossing the Loschwitz Bridge one Saturday morning under a bluish mist and thinking that loyalty works like the steel of the Blaues Wunder. It holds more than it deserves, until one day it doesn't. You don't decide that moment. You just hear the crack. And then you understand that the cathedral of your home is full of new stone pretending to fill old voids. A couple of weeks later, I received the summons for a preliminary hearing. I won't describe that room. Courtrooms all share a particular smell: damp paper and freshly pressed suits. You walk in and sit straight. You answer, then stay quiet. I showed the map I'd built. Spoke the language of technicians, but in a low voice, with sentences made of flesh. The prosecutor watched me with the focus one gives a clock that's finally keeping time. Their lawyers took the usual route: question the logs, talk about shared IPs, suggest that I possess special tools that might have caused confusion. I wasn't offended. I did my part, explained the method, chain of custody, temporal correlation, indicators of compromise. Everything timed. Everything with the patience of a man who knows that truth, once lined up, defends itself. When I stepped outside, it was snowing. Snow, when it falls on a city already swollen at the heart, sounds like a pause. There was no hand on my shoulder. No cinematic embrace. Nothing. That's the most honest thing I can say. I rode the tram back to Dresden, watching my reflection in the glass as if I were a stranger returning home for the first time. Opened the door. The house smelled of dust and things that missed a body. On my desk, the laptop waited like an old dog. I opened a new folder, named it with date and time. Closed it. Made tea. Sat down. Told myself I'd sleep early. I didn't. With time, you start to remember in colors. The gray of guilt feels like afternoons on the Brolsch terrace. The red of desire, because yes, it still exists, even if it doesn't belong here, visits me sometimes in the skin, when someone brushes my hand on the tram and I remember that I'm alive. The gold of redemption I haven't seen. Not yet. But I did see a different light in my grandmother's eyes the day we began sorting through box after box, paper after paper, filing, keeping, discarding, as if cleaning a house after a flood. She'd sometimes tell me stories about her father in the shop, how they used to weigh sugar, how honesty was measured in grams. I listened the way you listen to an old radio in the next room. Those voices make the world believable again. People ask if I forgave them. I don't know what meaning they reserve for that word. I can say this: I stopped spending time on the hypothesis that things could have been different. The mind, left alone, invents alternate versions of your life like endless television series. I turned it off. Understood that betrayal isn't an accident, it's a sustained choice. You can understand the motives of the one who betrayed you, you don't have to share them. It doesn't heal you, but it brings order. With order, I could work again. The first week was like walking with stones in my pockets. The second, as if someone had replaced every light in the house with a colder one. By the third, I stopped thinking of nights as a test. Every city has a corner where you can breathe and decide to keep going. For me, it was a wooden bench near the Albertinum, watching the few who paused to look at the sculptures behind the glass. Mondays, at that hour, almost no one is there. The Elbe flows on rigid, patient. Women walk folded inside their coats. A saxophonist plays a short melody from time to time, as if reminding himself he exists. I sat there a few times. Repeated the sequence of events under my breath, without adjectives, as if presenting them to an invisible jury. When I finished, I felt lighter. Maybe that was forgiveness, not for them, for me. But I'm not sure. I don't aim for a clean ending, I aim for silence that doesn't hurt. I saw Janelle once, from afar, leaving a bakery in the Asir Neustadt. She had the same expression as always, that furrow in her brow when she thinks too much. Our eyes didn't meet. Some encounters, if they happened, would only add words that no longer serve a purpose. I saw Axel on the opposite bank, walking fast, shoulders hunched as if carrying his own head. No greetings. None were needed. The case has its own path, one I no longer control. It's enough that I put everything down, steady hand, on paper. Someone told me it was cruel to press charges. That blood calls to blood. I don't share that barroom romanticism. The law isn't a shining sword you brandish to impress, it's a piece of furniture. A heavy one. And if you don't put it where it belongs, it blocks your way. I placed it where it needed to be. I don't feel proud of it. If anything, I feel order. When the snow melted, leaving that wet paste along the curbs, I'd already recovered what could be recovered. The rest, no one returns that to you. At Adelia's house, the windows started opening earlier. The smell of soup gave way to toasted bread. One day I heard her humming without words. I made a quiet joke, and she laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in a long time. She placed her hand on my neck when I said goodbye. I walked home on foot, crossing the bridge, watching the river that refuses to stay still, as if it knew better than we do how to keep going. I passed by the Semperoper, its proud facade still learning that arrogance has a cost. I think I learned something like that, too. I'm not a religious man, but I have my little rituals. One of them is checking my systems every morning with a cup of coffee in silence, updating lists, verifying integrity, breathing as if each hash were a kind of technical rosary. Thinking you can control what you love is childish. Thinking you can't protect it is irresponsible. Life happens somewhere in between. That narrow strip is where I work. The rest is stage dressing. These days, when I cross the Altmarkt and see tourists taking pictures without knowing what they're photographing, I feel part of the same comedy. I've taken pictures of things I didn't understand, just to keep them, just in case. My grandmother, who knows everything without saying much, placed a black notebook on the table last week and told me, "Write down what you don't want to forget." I wrote 3 words, "Don't let your guard down." Then another, "Know when to stop." Sometimes, knowing when to stop is what saves you. I could tell you this story ends in light, with reconciliations and shared breakfasts. It doesn't. Beauty, when it's honest, knows how to stay in the half-light. I don't invite Janelle over anymore. I don't open the door to Axel. I wish them both luck, not out of generosity, but out of hygiene. On Sundays I bring my grandmother bread from the Loschwitz market, and when the weather allows, we ride the tram together and get off at Schillerplatz just to watch how the Elbe remains the same river that endures us. On the Blaues Wunder, the wind hits you hard and tangles your thoughts. There, almost always in silence, I tell myself that a decent life doesn't need heroes, it needs people who do what's right when it hurts. People ask if I regret not having pretended less, not having warned them sooner. I don't. Theater tired me out in adolescence. If I pretended, it was for a simple reason: the predator is clumsier when it thinks the forest is asleep. I stayed still until it left enough tracks. That's enough for me. That's how I sleep. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with a sting, not in the body anymore, but in the mind. I retrace every step, as if searching for a crack in my own account. I don't find one. Not because it's perfect, but because it's true. Things happened the way I told them. From the outside, I see a man who walked on ice without falling. Maybe that's luck. Maybe practice. Maybe, in the end, I learned from Adelia to weigh sugar with the scale at 0. If anyone's waiting for some grand lesson, I only have one, and it's worth little in a book but everything in a kitchen. Don't assume your own aren't hungry. We all are. The difference lies in what we allow ourselves to eat. I chose not to bite into that hard bread that splits your cheek. Others made their choice. The rest is accounting in maps. Dresden, in its way, showed me structure. The Frauenkirche, rebuilt from stones of two different ages, is the perfect portrait of our family, a dome that looks whole, but up close you can see each old black stone beside a new pale one in mismatched teeth that somehow still fit. You don't have to hate it. You just have to know where to step. I do now. I walk slower, maybe. More at night. But I walk. I don't know if I forgave them or if I simply stopped holding the rope that tied us together. What I know is this: the money is where it belongs, far from the mouth that bites without satisfaction, and my grandmother's house smells of bread again. And I sleep a little colder, yes, but without fear. And that, though it doesn't look good in a photograph, is enough to cross the bridge again.